In particular for women, and when it comes to women's mental health, I think, are all in this place where we understand the system is rigged. We all know that wellness is broken. We live in a country where 30 million people don't have health insurance, where 25% of Americans aren't able to take a paid sick day, where if you're a Black woman, it's going to take you 19 months to make the same amount of income that a white man will make in a year. I always like to say you can't meditate your way out of a 40-hour work week with no childcare. That's not going to fix all these problems, yet that is constantly what we see on social media. We live in a society that is really drawn to quick fixes. And we, I think, as a culture, have a hard time investing in longer term solutions. So what I'm trying to do is have a new conversation about how we define self-care, and one that really takes the focus off of any one particular activity and instead draws your attention to the process that you're taking to get to, whether it's a yoga class or whether it's a massage, because that internal work, that internal process, that's actually the work of real self-care. So when we're talking about faux self-care versus real self-care, I recently had a patient in my practice who shared an example that I think will resonate with everybody. She spent all this time clearing her schedule to actually get a massage. And she spent the whole time at the massage worrying about everybody else in her life. Did her husband make sure that the kids had their packed lunch? Who was going to make sure that they had scheduled the doctor's appointments for next week? She spent the time that she was supposed to be, quote unquote, using for self-care, worrying about everybody else. I'm defining faux self-care as a quick method that you can use to feel better, but that does nothing to solve the larger problems in your life or the larger problems in our society as a whole. So a method, if we're talking about faux self-care, is something like getting a massage or taking a bubble bath or going to a yoga class. Again, not that these things are bad. It can serve as an escape. It can serve as sort of a release of a pressure valve because things just feel like too much. But again, doing one of those methods is not going to be something that actually changes the systems of stress or the systems of oppression that are going on in our world at large, and also that are going on in all of our own lives and in our own family systems. So real self-care is actually an internal decision-making process that helps you think about how you're spending your time and how you're making choices. It's a set of principles. It's not rules for you to follow. It's not something for you to just check off the list. It's actually a different way of thinking. And the reason that this is so great is because you can carry it with you for all different stages of your life. So the 4 principles of real self-care are: 1, learning to set boundaries and deal with guilt. 2, speaking to yourself with compassion. I will say that this one is really hard. It's the one that I struggle with the most. The 3rd is getting closer to your values and identifying what really matters, which means coming back to your internal sense of self as opposed to any particular external goal. And then lastly, the 4th principle of real self-care is power. All of this work that I'm teaching in real self-care is about taking back agency, taking back power, and creating space for ourselves. We are conditioned as women, especially if you're somebody who is a caretaker or a mother, especially if you're a woman of color or a Black woman. Our entire society is built on essentially the unpaid labor of people who identify as women. So we've internalized this. So anytime you set a boundary, anytime you reclaim space for yourself, there's going to be this automatic and requisite, almost allergic reaction, we can call it. So this is why using principles instead of specific methods is so important, because with the principle, you can apply it over all of the different seasons of your life. Again, it comes back to you. It's an internal process. It's not something that someone else can tell you or that you can just buy. So the reason that boundaries are the very first principle of real self-care is because setting boundaries is the most important thing that you can do to reclaim your time and your space and energy. Without boundaries, there's no space for you. And the honest news is that boundaries are the most difficult part of real self-care. And it's definitely where my patients struggle the most. The way that I like to think about boundaries is that there's two separate processes that are going on at the same time. So let's take the example of setting boundaries with family members, because we know that's always the most difficult. The first process that's going on at a very tangible operational level is that you need to clearly communicate what you want and what you need from your family member. So in real self-care, I explain that as you always have three choices. You can say no, you can say yes, you can negotiate. Oftentimes when we use the word negotiate, we're thinking about, a business meeting or a work setting. But in reality, when it comes to boundaries, our entire interpersonal lives are all about negotiating, whether it's, who's coming to that dinner party or what are we going to do for Thanksgiving this year? This is all a version of negotiating. So when it comes to that operational communication process, it's about getting comfortable asking questions, being okay making requests. All of this is relatively, I don't want to say simple, but it's pretty clear cut. The second process is the much more difficult part. And that, of course, comes down to feelings. Feelings are always the hard part. So when you set a boundary with somebody in your family and you're not somebody who typically has set boundaries, of course that person is going to have feelings. They're going to be annoyed. They're going to be upset. And you're going to feel guilty because you're human. And if you're a woman, we have, guilt is just this, I call it a faulty check engine light. It's always there, no matter what you do. So the antidote here is that you have to remember that the person that you're setting the boundary with is never going to make you feel better. It's not their job to stop your feelings of guilt. You have to learn yourself to tolerate that guilt and understand that guilt does not need to be your compass. You also need to learn to have your own community, your own support system, so that you can take those hard feelings and have a space to put them and hold them and process them. So whether that's a therapist, whether that's a friend that you can text who is non-judgmental and understanding, it's your work to take those feelings and make sense of them and not be beholden to them. It's not the other person's job to give you permission. So one of the ways that I like to work with guilt is to be honest about the fact that it's never going to go away. And when you try to build your life with the goal of never feeling guilt, paradoxically, then you're just completely controlled by guilt. So instead, what we need to do is just turn the volume down. Turn the volume down on guilt. It doesn't need to be the thing that's controlling all your decisions. You also are never actually going to get rid of it, but that's okay. It can just be background noise. I think part of the hard thing is that, especially as women, we often feel like, I'm just one person. Like, what can I really do? I don't have time. I don't know how to do any of this stuff. I'm not an activist or an advocate. That's where we have to come back to agency and power, because you don't have to be an activist or an advocate. You just have to ask yourself different questions and be willing to have hard conversations with your family members for these decisions to then come about at a larger scale. In the book, I talk about a patient who went through the process of real self-care, learned how to set boundaries, was more compassionate with herself, and ultimately had some really hard conversations with her husband, which led him to ask for paternity leave, paid leave from his job, which they granted. And that went on to impact every single other employee who worked at that company. So none of that would have happened unless my patient went through her own real self-care process. Again, this is a framework that if we all do our own part in looking deeply at ourselves and coming up with new solutions for the way that we engage in our own families, in our own systems, it has the potential to actually transform our entire culture.